Hey, welcome back to Mike Reads the World. The last few weeks, I've had the pleasure of joining Tom and Don at the podcast You Can't Win to discuss Correction by Thomas Bernhard. And we did it in 2 episodes corresponding to the 2 parts of this novel. It's cut right down the middle, basically, by 2 parts with no other chapter or paragraph breaks. So that gives you an idea of kind of the experimental style. I will link the 2 episodes of the podcast in the description. So we read the first part, discussed it, and then did the first episode. We read the second part, and then in the second episode talked kind of about the work as a whole. So depending where you're at with the book, if you haven't read it all and you're just interested or maybe started it, you might want to listen to episode 1 first. If you've already finished it, it's up to you. You could probably skip to part 2 where we're discussing the thing as a whole, and it might be a bit more insightful than the first part. Or interesting. So it's up to you. But I will give you, this episode is basically just to let you know that I did this and where you can find it. So check the link in the description. But I will kind of talk a little bit about some things around it that I didn't get to talking about in the podcast. And I also wanted to show some of my crazy notes that I took in the book. It's a book if you get sucked into, it's about 3 characters who are all very kind of intellectually obsessed with something. And so if you find yourself kind of trying to unravel this book and making notes in it, you feel yourself very much stepping into the book. And I'll show kind of my crazy notes as Tom suggested on the podcast. I'll show them at the end of the video, kind of just paging through it. So anyway, that'll be there. And then also, I will say that if you're interested in more of Thomas Bernhard's work, Jason at the Channel of a Disappointed Man has a great video on where to start with Bernhard and what to read. You can really start anywhere. I think I started with one that most people recommend you don't start with, but that video is there too, and he also has some other videos on Bernhard's work. So, with that, I'll just give you a little description of Correction. Basically, an eccentric guy has built a building called the Cone, for his sister. This guy and his sister are both deceased. The guy built the Cone while living in the attic of another eccentric guy who lives in another very eccentric house. And our narrator of the story goes to live in this attic of that same house, trying to piece together the writings that the guy who built the Cone left behind. So it's, you can really get an idea of what kind of book this is, I think, just from that brief 1-sentence description. And anything else you want to know, you should probably just listen to the podcast. But I will say one theme. I'm going to talk a little bit about a theme that stood out, which was the sort of this. We live in a modern age where we have sort of all these sort of sciences and medicine and art, and this is a lot of great stuff, right? It's a lot of stuff that's very enjoyable to explore in life. But what it seems that a lot of us end up in this drive to create the greatest thing or something that has never been done before. To push barriers to, and this reminded me so much of the House on the Rock, which is in southern Wisconsin, in Spring Green, Wisconsin, that I visited a few years ago, and I got this sort of souvenir book, and it was built basically, by this eccentric rich guy to be sort of a reflection of his own personality. And the house of his dreams, really. And this idea of the transference of one's psychology into a building is very present in Thomas Bernhard's Correction. And so it reawakened this sort of temporary obsession I had with the House on the Rock, and something I think, to return to and write about in the future. So, and the guy who built the House on the Rock, which you can visit, it's open to the public. It's basically somewhere between It's a house that's basically a museum, but half of the stuff in it is fake or fabricated and not authentic like a museum. So it's also kind of just an art piece. And he was inspired, or one of his favorite poems is in this collection, Vagabond's House by Don Blanding. And actually that's the titular poem. Actually, that poem is really long, so I think I'll save it for another video that I may in fact talk about House on the Rock in much greater detail. I have so many thoughts about it, but I'm really glad at least, that correction brought my mind back to this and thinking about sort of the meaning of art and work and science and how we pursue these things, to what aim, to what end. The idea of human loneliness, nature, our relationship with nature. By stripping down to a kind of minimalist symbol, correction, and people's reaction to this minimalist symbol of a cone that represents other things in the story as well. It really allows you to come at this book from a lot of different places, have a lot of different kinds of thoughts about it, and acts almost in the same way as the literality of a folktale, as I mentioned in the last video, containing a lot more meaning than any sort of interpretation that we can give it. In this way, I think, it reinforces sort of how Italo Calvino too saw. People would call his writing postmodern, but I think he saw himself doing with postmodernism as myth-making, as folk-telling, and striving to create the same sort of three-dimensional space of mind that is open to interpretation and much more rich than any sort of, it's not trying to teach you, and it's not trying to tell a story. It's trying to give you a conceptual, object in which to reflect a lot of different possibilities. It's a really hard thing to define. It's kind of that, in a conversation I had recently, it's just, we all know what postmodern is, but we can't define postmodernism, but we all know what it is. So it's just, it's a really difficult thing to pinpoint, and some people might consider it a useless idea anyway. So I'll cut my ramble short this time and just show kind of some of my scribblings in correction before I cut the tape. So take care.